Well, Burke, I'm Stan Reeser. I'm running for the Kansas legislature in the 97th district. It's a district that represents a few southwest Wichita precincts around the Pawnee and Meridian area, and then it covers all the neighborhoods that circle and surround the airport. That's the 97th district. And basically, I'm running to bring back some fiscal responsibility to the state of Kansas, and also to be a advocate for strong schools. There's a double problem I feel that's been going on in Topeka, and that is number one, we've dug ourselves our hole with this so-called Sam Brownback experiment, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But you combine that digging of a hole with the Brownback experiment with taxes and with the deficit spending and the fact that we're borrowing money from Wall Street to pay for this experiment because we've wiped out all our cash reserves. And then on top of that, they doubled down by being very disrespectful. And I'm talking about the current legislature and the governor and his allies in the Kansas legislature. And I'm running against one of his allies, and it's basically they have doubled down into the fact that not only are they creating such a financial mess for Kansas, and I'm concerned that my children, your children, and our grandchildren will be still paying off this debt 20 years from now. And everyone knows, I mean, we've seen it at the federal level, is that once the debt starts, once the deficit spending starts, it is almost impossible to stop. So we have to send a clear message to the governor's allies in the state legislature that this type of deficit spending has to end, and it has to end in this next coming legislative session that starts in January. And then on top of that, they have been very anti-public education, this current governor and this current legislature. One of the first things that drew my attention was the fact that they took away due process for teachers. And what that means is that when a teacher is up for disciplinary action and that something went on in their classroom or something they did, there was a due process, meaning they had a chance to present their case. Sometimes it went to a legal process, but most of the time it was an informal process in which the teacher had a chance to present his or her side of the conflict or the problem which led to him or her getting fired or possibly getting fired. Well, the state took that right away from teachers. And to me, that was pretty un-American. I think most American workers deserve a due process for their case. But what made it seem particularly cruel to do it to teachers was the fact that we're in this anti-science process now, and that any teacher who tries to teach science, if you happen to be in a school district that is very anti-science, has an anti-science feeling in it, then a science teacher could get fired just for teaching science. And so it just seemed really bad that they did that. But that's actually just a fairly small problem compared to what they've done to education funding. They took away things like weighing what a special needs child school district gets paid for, reimbursed on. Wichita Public Schools tend to have far more special need kids than your suburban school districts or your private school districts. Well, what happened before was there was a formula which was always considered constitutional, but it was a formula that gave school districts, like if you had 15 children with autism in that school district, then that gave you a little bit more state aid. And it made sense because it was like, well, this school district doesn't get to pick, not to have these 15 students with autism in it. So that the formula took care of that problem. Well, they eliminated the formula and basically just came up with what they called a block grant. And the block grant was just basically a flat amount of money for your students. Thus, if you had two school districts, let's say both of them had 10,000 students in it, they both got the exact same amount of money, which, common sense would tell you, okay, that's fine, that sounds fair. The only problem with that is, let's say school district A, of those 10,000 students, let's say they have 1,000 special needs students. And school district B, who also just got $10,000, only has 500 special needs students. But they still got the same amount of money, and the school district A that has the extra 500 special needs students, they're going to be short. They're going to have a hard time trying to pay for staff, pay for what they need in order to educate that child. And as we all know, public schools is the exact opposite of the private schools, in that a private school can decide whether or not they want you as a student or not. Public schools do not have that choice. That is in our Constitution. Everybody's going to get an education, no matter what your disability, what your special need is. And we're not talking about just disabilities when I talk about special needs, is that you're also talking about gifted programs. If you had the IBB program at believe it's still at East High, isn't it?
East.
Yeah. They are going to suffer under this block grant versus a weighted system as well, because when a big lump sum of money comes in, then what's going to happen is they're going to make sure, that the regular students get get educated first. They're probably even going to head more toward making sure the special need kids get what they need, and the gifted program's probably going to be the last thing they consider funding. So, the combination of the fact that we have created such a fiscal mess here in the state of Kansas, and the fact that we have doubled down on this brownback experiment by basically being anti-public education, it just means that we have to replace a lot of people that are up in the legislature, and that's basically why I'm running.
Since you brought it up, the block grant for the schools, they've taken away the formula. I've heard a lot of people talk about the fact that the people that we've elected to run our school board, we elected them because they're educators, not because they're budgeters. And since the state no longer offers sets of money for different programs, it's now up to the districts, and people who weren't brought into office because of their financial responsibility, but because of their educational responsibility, are now having to make financial decisions that it's actually exacerbating the problem. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, it does create a problem, because number one, the other part of that, Burke, is the fact that not only did they send money in a different way, which did not take into account what's going on particularly in their school district, but they are also putting restrictions on the school board, the local school boards, of how much they can make their mill levy to raise money for their schools. So basically they're saying, here's the money that we're giving you, but if your community decides that you understand that school building X is crumbling and falling down, and we have to replace it next year, and that's going to create a mill levy increase on your property tax, the state's saying, no, you can't do that. So it's kind of like, and here's the ironic part of this, Burke, is that the people who are in majority right now in Topeka have for years cried about the tyranny of Washington, D.C. Basically, and I agree with them. I mean, they're saying Washington, D.C. has always come up with this one solution fits all, and it doesn't work. Because things that might work in Brooklyn, New York are not going to work in Wichita, Kansas. Things that work in Wichita are not going to work in Hokum, Kansas. So you have to develop your funding, you have to develop your programs designed on what works in that area. So Topeka used to always complain about Washington, D.C., saying, okay, you're sending us this money, but we have to use it exactly the way you tell us to use it. And now Topeka is doing that to the local school boards. They are saying, here's your money, here's your part of the pie, but you have to spend it exactly the way we say you spend it. So the things they used to complain about in Washington, D.C., they are now practicing in Topeka, Kansas.
I don't think that anybody can rationally argue that we don't have serious problems in our schools.
Right.
We also know that the root of all evil is money, and we've got a lot of evil in our political environment the way it is right now. Some people, including the gentleman I interviewed last week, Mike Capps, has pointed out that some of what Brownback has done has helped keep small businesses afloat in Kansas by lowering or eliminating their taxes that they owe. Although I don't think anybody can say that you can not pay taxes and spend money as a government and ever come out in the black. You're always going to end up in the red. Is there anything about our current tax plan that you think is beneficial, or do you think we need to wipe the whole thing out and need to start over from scratch?
Well, you actually are. It's really, there's two parts to that question, Bert. Number one is tax fairness. Everybody who benefited from that LLC tax exemption, where we wiped out income tax for 330,000 Kansans, of which, ironically again, the Wichita Independent Business Association polled their members, the ones who were benefiting from that tax cut, and they were saying no, we shouldn't pay zero. They're saying we should pay our share, and even they admit that this tax system under Brownback in this current legislature is unfair. So there's that question first. Plus, the other thing too is that's really important to remember here is that, and this is the part two of your question, is people need to realize that was not really a tax cut. That was a tax shift. If you make under $125,000 in the state of Kansas, and I think you're going to show this graph or this chart I have up on my Facebook page, and that is, if you are under that amount, your taxes, and the lower your income goes, the more they raised your taxes. The lower income people, their taxes were raised 11.2, I believe it's 11.2%, right around 11% increase. If you made over $400 and some thousand, your taxes were reduced by $2,000. So there was not a tax cut. There was a tax shift from those who make above average wages, and I'm talking about in the $100,000s. I'm not talking about people making $80,000 or $60,000 a year. Your taxes, if you're in that range, your taxes actually went up a little bit. So what they did was they shifted from taxing on the income tax these 330,000 Kansans, and they shifted it to a sales tax, to increase fees on your car, higher sales tax on your groceries, and it is basically a tax shift from those who are the wealthiest in Kansas to the middle class and to the lower class taxpayers in the state of Kansas. The net amount, there was no tax cut. There was no net tax cut. It was a net tax shift. And so that is what's really hurting the state budget.
I'd like to shift the conversation away from money for a few minutes. you've lived in the 97 district for
30 years.
long time, decades and decades.
Yes.
Um, you represented that area of town on our city council here in Wichita.
Yes, in the early 90s.
Um, tell me about that area, that district. Tell me about
That's a good question. Yeah.
why it's worth representing.
Well, no, that's actually a very good question because it kind of leads me to the point I just made last time about tax shift to the middle class. I remember when I was on the Wichita City Council, the area town that I represented, which was basically southwest Wichita, it was a little bit more south than this district is, whereas opposed to now this district is more a little bit of southwest and then moving out west. But there was a real strong middle class in the 1990s. Wages were up. You would see on your block during, you can almost call them the roaring 90s, because I remember almost every week seemed like somebody on your block had a new car or somebody was putting in a new lawn. I mean, there was disposable income, the economy was growing, and I'm not saying everybody benefited equally, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying there was more progress for the middle class and for working families during that time. Now you can walk these neighborhoods and you can see where the neglect has started. You can almost visualize exactly where the economic downturn after the 1990s started. And it's when we shifted to trickle-down economics, which basically what the Brownback experiment is. The Brownback experiment says that if we give a lot of money to the top incomes, that they will spend their money, the money will go float down. Well, it's exactly the opposite of what happens in an economy. Why the 1990s were so good for the neighborhoods and for the economy was because wages were increasing, there was jobs, there was competition for workers, you had wages going up, there was more disposable income. Thus, they went out and bought the car, and they bought something to increase the value of their home, or they bought a few more luxury items, or they took their kids to the movies more often. And so that money was used to create jobs, because that is the fallacy of trickle-down economics and the Brownback experiment. It's not the top that creates jobs. It's the bottom and the middle class that create jobs. As they have more money, they will spend more, they will spread their wealth out, thus creating the need for more product, more employees. That's what creates jobs. It's actually a process of calling the sky the ground and calling the ground the sky.
I happen to work inside of your district, just barely. I work very close to Maple over there. On the
you're just south of Maple, over there by Woodchuck.
Yep. And I know that the owner of my company would like me to ask you some questions. What do you feel about working with businesses that are in this area? Because there's also quite a bit of industrial in this area of town.
Yeah, the 97th district is a very large landmass because, number one, you have the airport in it. And, of course, that's going to take up a lot of land. But you've got on Pawnee, you have a lot of aircraft part suppliers. And you have, in your area, you have wholesalers, retailers. So, yes, there's a lot of business. But I think almost every district can count on the fact that they have they have several small businesses in them or medium-sized businesses. And the first thing I wanted to do once I get to Topeka is I do want to create a resource back in my district in all different areas, meaning small business, independent businesses, medium-sized businesses. And then I want to create a kind of a committee or a set of people that I can go to and talk to them about whether it affects our major employers here in Wichita, even if it's outside of my district. That way, when I have issues that come up in Topeka, and I don't know how it's gonna, I can read the material. I can ask staff there at state government about what this is gonna do. But a lot of times you just have to get on the phone and you have to call people like your boss and say, hey, there's a proposal up here going on right now. They're talking about doing this to the tax structure, or they're doing this, or they're talking about repealing this ordinance or something. How's this going to affect your business? So, and it's the same thing with education and other areas, such as I need to have a small group of teachers that I can call on a drop of a hat that live within the district, or work in a school that's in my district, so that if something comes up on education, I can ask them and because I really believe in talking to the people where the tire hits the road. Too many people want to speak to just the top CEOs or the top so-called experts on issues, and the reality is that information is good to have, and you need that information. But you also need to talk to the person and the people where a new law or a new tax code is going to affect them. You've got to get to the source, as close to the source as possible. So yes, I definitely want to set up and talk to the business owners in that district as well, because they have to be involved. They need to know what's going on, and I need their input in order to make a good decision when it's time to vote.
We all know Kansas has historically been a red state for long time, and we have a lot of Republican-leaning people in our state. You're going to have to work with both sides of the fence. You're going to have to work with Democrats and Republicans, both people who are way out on the edges and people who are kind of in the middle. What kind of plan or strategy do you have for how to work with people who don't necessarily agree with you? How do you feel about working with the other side? Is it about party lines, or is it about the work that's getting done? Tell me how you feel about those things.
I didn't anticipate you asking this question, Burke, but I'm really glad you did, because there's two parts, and I apologize if it seems like I'm splitting up every question in two parts, but there really is two parts to that. Number one, the historic background of Kansas is a moderate Republican-based set of policies. We have moved away from that, and there is already discussions, already things going on that moderate Democrats like myself will be working with moderate Republicans who win. And that is the one coalition, and the other side is really going to be radical Republicans, extreme Republicans, the ones who believe in Sam Brownback's plan, and they're going to defend it to the very end. So it's really, when you get up to Topeka, the coalitions are not really going to be Republican and Democrat. It's going to be moderates versus extremes. Now, some of us will have D's behind our names, some of us will have R's behind our names, but that really isn't what the party is. There really isn't a true Republican Party, and there isn't a true Democratic Party in the state of Kansas. It's really, and if you look back at our history, it's always been the mainstream moderates, which I'm a part of, versus the extremists that want a particular right-leaning ideological stance. And then the second part of that question is, absolutely, you have to work with the other side. I was given a good example of that by a current representative who said, he was giving me the example of they had a bill that they were that was really a bad bill. And they just about had it defeated. And then some guy went up to the podium and gave this fiery partisan speech, talking about how the other party was evil for even bringing this up. Well, that offended a bunch of people, and all of a sudden it just split to being a Republican Democrat vote. So when you get up to Topeka, or when I get up to Topeka, hopefully, is that what you have to be conscious of the fact is that whether you are a Republican or whether you're a Democrat, that should not define you. And I can find many cases where where I will agree with you, and it has nothing to do with party, and the same way as if I disagree with you, and we might be in the same party. And when I was on the Wichita City Council, that's what we did. At that, Bob Knight, Greg Ferris, Sheldon Kamen were more the conservative, but mainstream type of conservatives on the city council. I worked with them on many issues, and we had to work out the compromises. And it was actually, I think I look back on that now and say that's what we need in Topeka, is the fact that, and you have to become, to a certain extent, you have to kind of get to know that person. You have to get to know what they're really concerned about. You don't have to agree with them all the time, but you have to understand what's really, really important to them and what is a concern for them. So, and then and then they have to do the same for you. And by the time, when I was on the city council, we just worked things out like that. We was like, I know this really concerns you, and this is what concerns me. Now, is there somewhere in the middle we can meet? And that's what we used to do all the time, and I plan to do that in Topeka as well.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, because I haven't done my research, and that's my fault for this, but you actually were a political science major, weren't you?
No, actually, I was an education. I was a public education. I was an education major up to my senior year at Wichita State University, and then when you're going into teaching, you have a semester where you are a student teacher. Your last semester, you are a student teacher. Well, it's basically a 6-month job where you get no pay. And at that time, my wife and I, who've been married 35 years, we had a small child by then. And when I got to my senior year, I had all these credits. I was an education major, but I could not do that. I could not take 6 months off with no income because I already had a small family. But I didn't want to finish my college education. I didn't want to end my college education at 90 credits, So what I did on my last year was I switched my major to general studies. And so my bachelor's is in the Bachelor's of General Studies. It is basically a new way of saying, if you look back in the before the 1960s, it used to be called a Bachelor's of Liberal Arts. And it's basically, I did take a lot of political science, I took a lot of history, I took a lot of economics, obviously I took a lot of education classes, and those are my 4 main areas. And then I rounded it off with everything. It was kind of a well-rounded education, I thought. And it's ironic that my bachelor's degree actually says Bachelor's of General Studies, because that's really what I always have been, is kind of like generalist, as that I think it's important that you have people in office who can connect the dots between economics, family life, politics, governance, and because there's never one thing. Even your spiritual life, all these things are connected, and so I've always considered myself a generalist, where I try to look at the big picture and see how it affects everything, not just one particular thing.
You mentioned you've raised a family, and you've raised a family in the 97 district. Brag on your family a little bit.
Yeah, thanks, Burke. I appreciate you saying that. I have 3 daughters, and one of them runs a daycare center in Derby. My middle daughter right now is in St. Martin's. Her and her husband are in med school. And my youngest is still finishing up her degree, but she's in Florida right now. She ended up taking a one of those internships at the Walt Disney Company. She loved it so much, and she ended up moving down there. And so she's finishing up her school there. But you're right, we've lived there in the 97th District for over 30 years. All my kids went to schools that were in the 97th District. And I think I have a real connection with the neighborhood. I mean, I've worked in that neighborhood a lot. I know the people. They know me. And hopefully that will pay off on election day.
Now, I heard a story about you that back when you were on city council, you were so devoted to making sure that the city council stuff got taken care of that you actually switched jobs to go work at Quick Trip in the night so that you could dedicate your days to the city council. This isn't really a question. I just want to say that shows a lot of dedication to the fact that you wanted to make a difference.
I appreciate you saying that, Burke, because I have always been very committed to public service and community. Especially in today's day and age, it's so easy to get wrapped up in your individual problems, your individual efforts, that you forget that you are living less than 20 yards usually from your neighbor. And this is a community, and we have to find ways to live together. So yeah, when I was in public service in the city council, I made it a point I rearranged my job situation so that I could work third shift, and then I worked on city council and community issues as much as I could during the day till basically I fell asleep, till I had to fall asleep, and then I would get up and do it the next day. So yeah, I big believer in public service and community.
Or is there a message that you'd like to sign off with?
Well, Burke, there has been a thing I've been thinking about lately that maybe your viewers would be interested in, is that I think nowadays our public servants, our elected officials, don't take the time to reflect on issues anymore. I think there used to be a day when we had real statesmen, whether it was in Topeka or Washington, D.C., or on the city council or school board. We had statesmen or state women who would take time to reflect on what was best for their community. And there were times where they had to go tell their political party in DC that, hey, I know the party needs me to do this. I know the party wants me to do this, but I can't do this to the country, regardless of whether I'm voting against my own party or not. And I think that's the type of courage we're going to need now, because because this hole that we've dug for Kansas is not going to get fixed in a year. Unfortunately, it's going to take a while to dig. First thing we want to do is kind of like our fathers used to advise us: is that when you find yourself in a hole, quit digging. So the first step is we're going to have to stop digging. But I want to be an elected official that when I get up to Topeka, I'm going to take time, and it may mean I take a long walk around the Capitol, but I'm going to take time to reflect. I'm going to read the bills. I'm going to take time to reflect, and I'm going to try to make a honest decision on what's best for the 97th District, what's best for the state of Kansas before I cast that vote. And I hope we can get back to leaders like that someday.